Τόση Χριστέ ο Θεός ημών, ο πανσόφος τους αλείς αναδείξας, καταπέμψας αυτής το πνεύμα το Αγίον, και δι' αυτόν την οικουμένην σαγηνεύσας, φιλανθρώπε δόξασι. So until now we've been looking at the Gospel of St. Luke, because that's where we find all of the sort of the preamble to the life of Christ. That's where we hear the story of the Annunciation and the birth of St. John the Baptist and so on. After that we then come to the Gospel of Matthew, which begins with the story of how Joseph learnt of the pregnancy. But before that, Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus. Luke also has a genealogy, but he places that later on, after the story of Christ's birth and his childhood years. And so Matthew begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And unlike the prophets of the Old Testament who begin with the word of the Lord came to this person, or there was a vision here, or there was the Old Testament prophets always begin with some kind of context to give authority and to show the faithfulness of what's about to be related. The Gospel of Matthew simply says the book, because it is written for people who have already seen Jesus Christ and who are already convinced of his message, and who also knew Matthew and the other apostles as being reliable witnesses. So there is no need for Matthew to preface his book with anything else in order to he doesn't need to give any credentials, and so he simply says the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And the fact that he mentions first David and then Abraham is because the Gospel of Matthew is written first and foremost to a Jewish audience. And of course, the Jews who were expecting the Messiah, they knew that this Messiah had to be from the line of David and ultimately also from the seed of Abraham, because the promise was made to Abraham. According to the Church Fathers, this Gospel was originally written in Aramaic. The Aramaic version doesn't survive. The Aramaic Gospels that we have today that are used in the Syriac churches and so on, those are translations from Greek into Aramaic. So they are not the original Gospel of Matthew. A lot of people assume that those are the original Gospels and that the Greek texts are translations of those, but they're actually translations from the Greek. So if there was a Gospel of Matthew in Aramaic, we no longer have access to it. The Greek used in Matthew suggests that it's not a translation, it's a Greek composition. So Matthew most probably wrote a gospel in Aramaic and then wrote the gospel again essentially in Greek. So it's not a translation from Aramaic to Greek, but it's a second edition in a different language. Something I forgot to mention or didn't mention when we began looking at the Gospels is that a lot of the scholarly sort of presuppositions or assumptions about when Gospels were written and which one came first and all that kind of stuff are based on criteria that we wouldn't accept. When you hear about scholars talking about the historical Jesus or a historical approach or something like that, that doesn't mean historical doesn't mean what happened in the past. Historical means what can be discerned using the specific academic method that's called the historical method, which means, so for example, what you had for breakfast on the 24th of July 1993 is something that happened, but it's not a historical event because you don't have documentation, you don't have proof that would qualify from that perspective. Whereas if you had a diary entry or pictures from the breakfast or whatever, then it would be an historical event. And the historical method as outlined, as used in academia, by definition excludes anything supernatural, which means that the historical Jesus, according to this definition, he cannot have said that he was God, because the average Jew of the first century didn't claim to be divine. He couldn't have walked on water. He couldn't have been born of the Virgin. He couldn't have turned water into wine. He couldn't have been raised from the dead, by definition. So applying this historical method to a text that is talking about someone who's completely unique, and that has a divine context and a supernatural metaphysical context is basically pointless. And so one of the late dates, for example, that you get from a lot of scholars in terms of when the Gospels were written, are based on the idea that there's no such thing as prophecy. And therefore, because Christ says in the Gospel that Jerusalem will be destroyed and the temple will be destroyed, and that happened in 70 AD, they say, well, the Gospel must have been written after the destruction of Jerusalem, because he couldn't have known beforehand, because that's supernatural and therefore not historical. And so the Gospels may well have been written much earlier than what the average scholar suggests. And in the same way, the order of the Gospels do not necessarily conform to what modern scholarship would say. So that Mark, because it's the shortest Gospel with the least amount of information, the historical method would say that then came first, and then everything else was added. So because the virgin birth can't have happened, that was added later. And because, whereas from the church's perspective, and the fact that the Gospels are ordered the way they are in the New Testament from the beginning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, would suggest that probably that's the order that they were written in. And especially if the first Gospel was written in Aramaic, Matthew probably was the first Gospel that was written. And that's why St. Mark doesn't bother adding genealogies and details about Christ's birth and all of this stuff. And that's why he begins at the baptism, because Matthew had already done it and he was familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. So there's no it doesn't really matter which Gospel was written first, but just in terms of, we shouldn't take modern scholarship at face value, because it presupposes certain things that aren't, from our perspective, relevant or true. It makes no sense to apply a method that excludes the supernatural in order to work out whether or not Jesus really walked on the water, because it's a foregone conclusion. And so Matthew is writing first and foremost to a Jewish audience, and so his sort of concern is to prove to this Jewish audience that Jesus truly is the Messiah. And that's why the genealogy that he presents begins with Abraham, who was the beginning of the promise. And so Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers, and Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. We tend to skip all of these names very often when we read the New Testament, because they seem to just be a sort of a pedigree. But if we look at the meanings of the names and the stories behind every name, and of course Matthew is assuming that the people reading are familiar with the Old Testament, every one of these names has a particular story and makes a particular point, and reveals something about Christ. So, for example, we hear the names mentioned of women in the genealogy who were harlots, who were sinful. And one of the things that God wishes to convey with the mention of these people is that Christ embraces the entirety of humanity. So Christ came to heal and to embrace and to take on the whole of humanity in order to restore us. So he doesn't come from a sinless pedigree only of holy people who never did anything wrong. But there are people in his genealogy who were harlots, who were adulterers, who committed murder, like King David, who committed both of those sins. And it shows how when Christ assumed humanity, he assumed it for the sake of everyone, in order to restore everyone, and how no one is excluded from the promise of God. And it also shows how, in a more immediate sense as well, how if we attain holiness, we sanctify those who brought us into the world. And so when we strive for holiness and when we strive for perfection, we don't just sanctify ourselves, but we also sanctify those who brought us up. So if our sanctity can also be a blessing for our parents. And the commandments to honor your mother and father, it means first and foremost to live in such a way and to become such a person that your mother and father will be honored by your sanctity, so that on the day of judgment, when God asks them, what did you do with your life, they can at the very least say, we brought a righteous person into the world, despite our own failings and our own sins. And because very, very often this commandment to honor one's mother and father is interpreted to mean that you just obey whatever your mother and father tells you. And of course, within reason, that's part of the commandment, that if your parents give you a reasonable instruction, that you treat them with respect and obedience and so on. But if your parents are faithless or they might be drug addicts or alcoholics, they might be violent, they might be toxic and dysfunctional, whatever they may be, you don't honor them by just blindly doing whatever they tell you, or by ruining your own life in order to please them because they have some kind of psychological complex or whatever it is. You honor your mother and father first and foremost by living the way that God intends you to live, and then your entire lineage, in a sense, will be honored by your sanctity, because all of those human beings who came before you, those thousands of human beings that had to come together in a particular order in order for you to exist on the earth, if the only good thing they did was to bring you into the world, and you become a light to the world by conforming yourself to the will of God, their lives have meant something beyond just themselves. And so this is one of the reasons why all these people are mentioned by name, and why it also includes the most imperfect and sinful of people. You also have stories like after Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah, you have the sons of Judah, Pharez and Zara, and they were twins in the womb. And when Tamar was giving birth, one of them stuck out their hand and then pulled the hand back in, and the other child was born first. And Saint Theophylacti sees this as a revelation of how the grace of God, the gospel, initially revealed itself in a moment to the righteous people of the Old Testament, but then was withdrawn, and then they were first given the law in order to prepare them for the true revelation of the gospel, which was to come through the birth of Christ. And so all of these different names, if you go through them one by one, has a particular significance. And this is also why Matthew, when he talks about David begetting Solomon, he says specifically David begat Solomon of Uriah's wife. So he doesn't say David begat Solomon of Bathsheba, but he says of Uriah's wife, to highlight the fact that David took this woman from another man. He killed a man and took his wife, and they begat Solomon. So he's saying from sin, Christ came into the world, and for the sake of sin, Christ came into the world. The genealogy ends with Joseph, and of course Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus, and so a lot of people wonder what the point then is of giving a genealogy of Joseph which isn't biologically related to Christ, if the point is to show who Christ is. And one is the legal aspect, that legally speaking, your father, whether or not he was your biological father or not, was the one through whom you inherited legal rights and promises and so on, and therefore the legal rights, as it were, of Christ's messiahship came through Joseph, even though he was not biologically related to him. But Joseph's genealogy also includes the genealogy of the Virgin, because in the Old Testament you could only marry someone of the same tribe and of the same lineage, and so the genealogy of Joseph would have contained also the genealogy of Mary. And so even though Matthew is given the legal genealogy of Joseph, included in that also is the descent of the Virgin Mary. And he mentions how all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon there are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. And so each time a sort of axiomatic revolutionary person appears in the history of the Hebrew people, they are separated by 14 generations, and therefore Christ was born at that moment when, historically speaking, it was expected that another great event would take place, and another great person would take place. Luke gives a reverse genealogy in his gospel, and he begins not with Abraham but with Christ, and then works his way backwards. And he ends not with Abraham but with Adam, and he calls Adam the son of God. And the reason for this is that while Matthew is writing to the Hebrews, Luke is writing to the Gentiles, and therefore the Gentiles do not have Abraham as their common father, but they have Adam. Adam is the one who he is the common father of all nations of the earth, and therefore every Gentile tribe looks to Adam for their descent. And he begins and he ends with God in order to show how God is the beginning and end of all things, and how the person who was born is the same person who created Adam in paradise, and how the whole thing is full circle. And he also mentions how Adam did not have a mother and father, and in order to show that this was the second virgin birth that took place. The book of Genesis makes a point of saying that the earth from which Adam was taken was untilled, and that no man had worked the earth, no man had touched the earth, and so he was taken from virgin soil. And so the Holy Fathers, they see a parallel between the creation of Adam and then the birth of the second Adam. So Luke is pointing out that this is not an event that should be dismissed as being new to the conscience of the church, or new to the revelation, the divine revelation, but it's a recapitulation, it's a repetition of what happened at the beginning of mankind. And of course that also gives the message that the purpose of this birth was the renewal of mankind, that this is a new beginning. And the term Son of God, used of Adam, and also of many other people in the scriptures, is also the reason why Christ is called the only begotten Son of God. The Greek word monogenes doesn't only mean only begotten, but it means unique, because the genes, it doesn't come from gena, birth only, but it has the same root as when we say in English genus, like a species. And so it's not just the only birth, the only one born, but it's the unique Son of God. So Jesus Christ is not the Son of God in the same way that anyone else can be called the Son of God. And the word only, monogenes, has to be understood in this way. So not simply that only one has been born of God, but that he is unique. So he's not the Son of God in the way that Adam is, or the way that other people in the scriptures are, or the way that we are when we become sons and daughters of God through adoption. But he is the unique Son of God. So people sometimes try to dismiss the divinity of Christ by saying so and so, and is also called the Son of God, or that people are collectively called the children of God. But this is why Scripture uses this word monogenes, that he is unique. The genealogy in St. Luke's Gospel is different from that of Matthew, and some people say the reason for that is that Matthew is given Joseph's lineage, whereas Luke is giving the Virgin Mary's lineage. There are also other interpretations that they are both lineages of Joseph, but the explanation that one is Joseph's and one is Mary's is the most common one. And you can also therefore see the difference of perspective. If you look at St. Luke, all of his focus in the early years, the beginning of the Gospel, is he's seeing it through the eyes of the Virgin Mary, in a sense. He talks about Mary's meeting with Elizabeth, he talks about the Annunciation, he talks about all the things that Mary would have been a part of and been privy to, whereas Matthew, in the beginning of the Gospel, he begins with Joseph and how Joseph reacted to the to learning about the birth, and he also mentions the flight into Egypt, and so on. And this is probably because Matthew, who was in Jerusalem and he was writing to the Jewish people, he would have learned most of these details from St. James, the brother of the Lord, who was the son of Joseph from his previous marriage, according to the tradition of the church. Whereas St. Luke, who was the companion of the Apostle Paul, would probably have learned what he knew from directly or indirectly from the Virgin Mary, who lived with St. John the theologian until her death, and he then went to Asia Minor, to Ephesus, and so he probably learned it through, if not St. John directly, but through his circle. And so in a sense, the early parts of the Gospel of Matthew are seeing things through the eyes of Joseph, whereas the Gospel of Luke are seeing things through the eyes of the Virgin Mary. And that's also why you have only, I think, in St. Luke's Gospel, I might be getting myself mixed up, but it's in St. Luke's Gospel where you have this repeated phrase that the Virgin Mary kept these things in her heart and pondered them. And so Luke gives you an insight into the inner life as well of the Virgin in a way that St. Matthew doesn't. And so after the genealogy, it says, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary, the betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, the fathers point out that saying before something happened doesn't mean the thing happened. The church confesses that the Virgin Mary is ever virgin, before, during, and after the birth of Christ. And this is also why the church calls Saint Joseph the betrothed. He was betrothed to the Virgin Mary, but he was not her. They were not married in the sense of consummation. This is also why we don't have these Roman Catholic icons of the Holy Family, where you see the Virgin Mary, Joseph, and Christ as being a single family unit. In Orthodox iconography, Joseph is always standing off to the side, just to show how his relationship to Christ is different from Christ's relationship to his mother. And so before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. And then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. The law of the Old Testament basically appointed the punishment of stoning for adultery. And so the assumption, obviously, the societal assumption would be that if Joseph divorced her because she was with child, people would assume that she had been impregnated by another man, and therefore she was liable to die. And this is why it says that he wanted to put her away secretly, so that she would not be publicly shamed, and also so that she would not be harmed. Saint Theophylact, he says that Joseph didn't want to put her away because he thought she had done something sinful, and that he was ashamed and could no longer be with her, but rather he wanted to put her away out of reverence, because he understood, he believed, knowing the character of the virgin, he knew that she was telling the truth, and that the child conceived was of the Holy Spirit. But he wanted to put her away because of the great unworthiness he felt, and this is what is meant when it says he was a just man. And a just person is not aware, let's say, of their own justice, but the greater the level of a person's holiness and self-understanding, the more sinful and unworthy they feel. And so, being a just man, Joseph wasn't able to, didn't feel worthy to be in the presence of such a great event, and therefore he wanted to put her away quietly and to excuse himself, as it were, from what he deemed himself unworthy of. And this is why the angel says, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary, your wife. So he doesn't say don't be ashamed to take Mary your wife, or he says don't be afraid, because he was afraid of the presence of God. He was afraid of this great miracle and the greatness of the what was about to take place. And then we have the prophecy from the book of Isaiah. So all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated, God with us. Then Joseph, being roused from sleep, did as the angel commanded, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. So again, the fathers say the fact that it says he did not know her until she brought forth her son does not mean that they, after she brought forth her son, that they then consummated the marriage. Like Christ says, I am with you until the end of the age. It doesn't mean that when the age is finished, Christ will disappear and we'll be on our own again. The fathers point this out, that you shouldn't make that conclusion based on the word until. So until just means that he had no part in the conception of Christ. It doesn't suggest that they then consummated the marriage after. In the Hebrew text of Isaiah, the word where it says the virgin shall be with child, the word is Alma, which means a maiden, and it's quite a common Jewish response, and you'll also hear others make this point, that Alma can just mean a young woman, and therefore there's nothing miraculous about it. It's just a woman shall be with child, and Matthew somehow mistranslates the text, and then he makes up the story about the virgin birth in order to... The word Alma means an unmarried young woman, and so it implies virginity. And when the translators of the Old Testament translated the scriptures from Hebrew into Greek 300 years before the coming of Christ, they chose the word parthenos very deliberately and very specifically. And this again is why the church prefers the Septuagint text of the Old Testament to the extant Hebrew version, because it tells you with great clarity how the text was interpreted by the Jews before the coming of Christ. Current Jewish interpretations of the Old Testament are post-Christian and very often anti-Christian. And so if Christians interpret a prophecy in a particular way, they will choose the opposite interpretation so as to remove themselves from the Christian point of view. And then others then look to them and they say, well, the Jews are the original faith. Judaism is the faith of the Old Testament, and so their interpretation must be older and must be more original. But Christianity and Judaism both have the Old Testament in common, but Christianity is not a continuation of Judaism. Both religions come from the same source, but modern day Judaism is more recent than Christianity. The New Testament comes before the Talmud, and the Christian interpretations of the Old Testament are older than the modern Jewish interpretations of the Old Testament. So there's no merit to the argument that Matthew somehow misunderstood or got it wrong or mistranslated. And the understanding of the prophecy had always been that the virgin, someone who had not been with a man, would be with a child, and that this would be a great sign, a great miracle. And of course, if it was just a random young woman who got pregnant in a normal way, Isaiah wouldn't refer to it as a sign. It would be an everyday event, so it doesn't make sense in any case. Yeah, it's past 8 o'clock. Anyone has a quick question, feel free, and then we can finish. Yeah. So the Aramaic Gospels that we have today. So if you go to one of the churches where Aramaic is the liturgical language, so like the Nestorian Church or the Syrian Monophysite churches or the Maronite Church, where they use Aramaic in the service, the Gospels they have in Aramaic are translations from the Greek. But the fathers say that the original Gospel of Matthew was written in Aramaic. So he wrote the Gospel in Aramaic according to the fathers, but the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew that we have now is not the one written by Matthew. It's a translation from the Greek. If that makes sense. Michali, you had a question? The Talmud is just a collection of different rabbinical teachings and most of it sort of discussions between different rabbis on different aspects of the law and interpretations and clarifications. But that the Talmud is sort of what makes Judaism. And modern day Judaism understand the Old Testament through the eyes of the Talmud. They interpret the Old Testament through the eyes of the Talmud. And so since the Talmud comes after the New Testament, Judaism is a more recent religion. Like of the two religions that have the Old Testament as their original, let's say, text, Christianity is the older religion. So it's wrong to assume that Judaism is the sort of prequel and Christianity is the add-on. Judaism, as we know it, is a more recent religion, and so the interpretations of the Old Testament that you find in the New Testament and in the Church Fathers and so on are more ancient readings of the Old Testament than what you will find in the Talmud, because a lot of the contributors to the Talmud, they lived in Christian societies and they were reacting against Christianity and interpreting the Bible in a deliberately sort of non-Christian way. Anyone else finished?
Σώσον Κύριε τον λαό σου και ευλογήσον την κληρονομίαν σου. Νίκας της βασιλεύσιν κατά βαρβάρων δωρούμενος και τους ονφυλάτων εδία του σταυρού σου πολίτευμα. Διευχών των Αγίων Πατέρων ημών Κύριε Ιησού Χριστέ ο Θεός ημών ελέησον Ιησούς ημάς. Αμήν.